Hello everyone, it's been a while since I've done a video, and today I have the Arnu Mach 10, which is a TV box from 2016. I had this sitting on my shelf for many months, but I thought it was about time to put this thing to good use. It is a Android box and it does have an ARM processor in it. Okay, so please join me today for this video and we'll make our way into this dark rabbit hole that is the Arnu Mach 10. It took me a while to actually get around to even powering this thing up, but to my surprise it did power up. Well, not exactly, but this is where the fun just begins. Initially I had thought that it was dead on arrival because the LCD that I was using didn't support the resolution that it was trying to display. When I found a display that was happy with the resolution, which turned out to be a TV, then it booted straight into a heavily modified version of Kodi, sporting the cool logo of Pure Linux. Although I'm not sure if it was just laughing at me at this point. Knowing that it at least works, I was able to plug a USB mouse and keyboard into it and get it working. So I delved around the specs to reveal that it is an AM logic chip, specifically the S12, which is an ARM version 7 processor, and it supports a thrifty but common Mali G450 GPU. I put the unit on my shelf for many months when I had more time to come back to it and explore this little monster, Android box. And many moons later, when I did finally get back to digging into this device, I had the hopes that the original Kodi would work and that I would at least be able to do some basic tasks with it. Unfortunately, my hopes were dashed because it was sitting on Kodi version 17.6, which was released in 2017. Oof. And if you know anything about Kodi, it is pretty much a requirement to stay up to date, as many plugins and things tend to break rather quickly if not done so. As expected, the YouTube app was not working. The weather app was working, but it was reporting from the wrong location. I figured maybe there's an update available for this thing, but because this is such a highly customized build of Kodi and the underlying Linux OS, that it would be a hopeless. It turns out that this little device is running a defunct version of Ember 5.0.0, which is the embedded entertainment ROM, and the original developers of this project are long gone. The link simply comes back is access denied. Even the underlying framework, JEOS or GOS, is under some licensing model that isn't free. Any attempt at installing plugins would have probably been a fruitless effort. At this point, it is a bit of a paperweight, and not even a good one at that. However determined I was, maybe it's my stubbornness, I can't possibly let this $10 box from 2016 go to waste. Heck no, I'm beating this thing into submission. So out comes the browser and what seems like years of research trying to find out any little thing about this box, and me being the total noob to Android reflashing and reimaging certainly didn't make the process any easier. The first thing I found was a post and teardown about the Mach 10 device, which to my dismay, after much trouble, later was not the revision I had. Apparently, there are two versions of this device, one with the AM Logic S812 and the S905. This becomes very important later, as I was looking for a very specific Linux-based image that would have worked for my unit. My initial intent was to try and install some sort of retro distro on here. I looked at Linux with RetroArch, Batacera, and Retro Orange Pi, as they all had ARM-based images or installers. All these choices and images left me totally confused, with my head spinning on what I should be picking, as this device obviously wasn't in the list. I managed to SSH into the box and ran some obscure command to find out what version of Android I should be aiming for based on my hardware. I think it was ADB, but when I went back the second time, I couldn't figure out what the command was. And then I had to figure out the password, which was a bit of a woof, because it turns out that the default password is "let me in." Maybe I should just let this thing out so it can do its business on the front lawn. And by business, I mean burning it with a torch or hitting it with a bat, just like in Office Space. That's a great movie. I went through many images from different OSs, and I wasn't exactly angry, but I was already a couple of weeks into the project and not making much headway. And the fact it took me forever to figure out I had to hold down a reset button on the inside of the audio port to be able to boot from an SD card didn't help. And if the image didn't work out with the particular hardware, it wouldn't boot at all, or it would reboot into the Ember recovery mode instead. So I wasn't getting anywhere. I was also under the impression that hitting Alt F2 would bring up a second console so I could do some hacking, but that wasn't working, or it was disabled by default. I spent a lot of time going around in circles, to say the least. I also opened up the device to see what kind of shenanigans I could get myself into. However, there wasn't really much on the device at all. Some RAM chips, the eMMC modules, the reset button, the AM logic processor / GPU, there was an Ether controller, and a breakout board for the front display. On the back side of the board reveals the Wi-Fi controller, the Bluetooth controller, which is 6112, which also has to be soldered to the board, the antenna that is. Once I finally figured out the actual hardware specs, I was finally able to find some sort of image to boot. The first was LibreELEC, which is just enough OS for Kodi. And as you can see from my images folder, I tried just a few and deleted many more. It turns out the most compatible image I could find were ones that were being used by the hard to find N200 variant. Don't ask me how I figured that out. It does include support for the networking of the box, which was a big bonus. And if you don't get the precise image for your hardware selection, it just won't boot. Coupled with the fact that there are device trees in some images that require you to find the correct .dtb file, then rename it, and then you got to put it in your root folder on the SD card boot partition, and then you have to make some changes to the uenv.txt file to point to the correct device tree file. Expect the worst and hope for the best. LibreELEC also had default images that would boot, but left me without proper hardware support. That's when I found some eclectic images from some rando guy on the internet who had up-to-date images, or at least that's what I thought. Even though the images are from 2013, sadly it is still based on Kodi 18. Kodi 18 is fine and all, but like the default image on this device, it was still too far out of date to have properly working plugins. Some worked and others didn't. I installed Mr. Boom, and it seemed to work correctly out of the box, and even with my Logitech joysticks after a bit of fiddling with the custom controls. Although I was getting some weird stuttering where it would pause during the game. This didn't happen the first time around, and I'm not really all that excited about this game anyhow to really try and fix it. As you can see, I'm probably better at blowing myself up more than the monsters. YouTube wouldn't work either because it required an API key, and I wasn't really in the mood to figuring it out as the instructions looked a little bit complicated and long. Maybe not as I expected to be, but I just didn't feel like it. I also tried installing and using the web browser from the Kodi repository, but it kind of ran like a frozen chunk of ice falling off the roof and onto my head, and I was really getting a headache at this point. I kind of wonder what the actual functionality of this thing is, as it seems that a text browser in the terminal would get me a better result. This wasn't a good start, to say the least. I then moved on to the second Linux-based distribution, which would actually run without a ton of hacking, and that was Armbian. Armbian, to me, should have been a thing that made me excited, as it seemed like it had everything already covered, or so I thought. This is really just the same old tired story. LibreELEC didn't have the right image for my hardware either. Swapping around DDP files and whatnot was not getting me anywhere. This led me down another rabbit hole that was quickly filling up my pants with sand, and like quicksand, I was beginning to sink and dread what was happening. The main developer who was doing the AM logic code, Balbs 150, seems to have dropped off the face of the planet. I can't even remember where I retrieved the first image, and it turned out to be Armbian 2111. I used Balena Etcher to make an image, which was by far the easiest imager in this situation, as it seems you can work directly from the compressed files. Through my searches, I found out that the MX3 Plus box has very similar hardware to this one, so I put my focus on this instead as my image of choice, and then changed the UENV.txt file to point to the new hardware IDs. I slapped in the SD card and let it do its thing. And lo and behold, we see a Linux boot up process. All this work to get here. ARM is just a real beast to deal with, and I haven't even delved into the Android side of it yet. Apparently I was supposed to have a backup of my eMMC firmware as well, but the hopes of finding one were dashed immensely, as the Arnu company, assuming it was actually legitimate, was nowhere to be found, lost in history as a cheap Chinese knockoff brand of another cheap Chinese knockoff brand of some other brand. The first boot of Armbian takes an incredibly long time. You could have a coffee and it would still be chugging away at a start job is running. Running from what I don't know, perhaps it is having a nightmare of actually having to run it all. In the end, once it was finished and running, you have yourself a somewhat bare version of Linux with no graphical user interface in sight. Apparently Linux didn't like that I wanted to use Mr. Duck as my password, but I forged ahead anyways into the new frontier. A frontier of self-disappointment. I suppose I do have a running version of Linux, and in theory I could do whatever I want at this point to customize the OS. However, Mr. Duck will have to disagree with that assessment. He would rather be waiting in warm water and enjoying the sun. I was kinda hoping that the built-in Armbian utilities would work, but apparently the major configuration tool is getting an overhaul. And that's when it hit me. The Ethernet was not working either. Yes, the image I chose did not like the network interface, so I had to break out a USB adapter. At least that worked out of the box. At least initially while off camera anyways. I thought I would try one more time, and lo and behold, one of the other device trees worked, and I have gigabit Ethernet, or at least seems to be working. Previously, I did end up trying to get the X Windows install with the Armbian image and try installing it from the Armbian config, but it would only boot with a black screen or hang at the last step as the X Windows system began to initialize. I wasn't too excited to try and troubleshoot it, so I left it at that. And speaking of leaving it at that, I am not even sure what to do at this point. I don't know if I should continue trying to fight with this thing or just leave it as it is and try to make a server use case out of it. But regardless, this thing has drained my energy. I think I might work on it a bit more and play around. I may even make another video if I get the energy. And I may even flash Armbian to the eMMC storage. and brick the thing unintentionally. But for now, I'm going to put this off to the side and let it do its thing, its best thing, which is being a paperweight. And hopefully this thing doesn't become a permanent paperweight if I end up messing up with the bootloader. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments or suggestions on what I can do with this Arnu Mach 10, please leave it in the comments below. Please subscribe and like the video if you're so inclined to. And Mr. Duck would also like to show his appreciation for you watching this video. He bids you a good day. Take care.